P. Diddy leaves the Metropolitan Detention Center jail in Brooklyn. New reports say he was taken to the hospital for a few hours last week to get an MRI. We're just now learning about this, though, because Diddy was taken from the jail late at night, actually using the cover of darkness to keep his trip on the down low. So what do we know about this trip? We're going to go through everything we know so far, plus a little more. We're actually going to sit down with Dr. D. Wayne Hendricks, a former corrections officer and deputy warden at MDC, the very jail Diddy's being held at right now. But before we get into all of that, here's a quick recap of how we got here. In September of last year, Diddy was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Those charges came down after multiple civil suits against Diddy were already filed, accusing him of facilitating a decades-long sex trafficking ring. Post-arrest, the civil lawsuits just keep on coming. Right now, we're actually at more than 40 filed against Diddy. There's an eerie pattern shown throughout all of these civil suits, and the criminal one too, that Diddy or his associates would drug the victims, rape them as part of what he called freak-offs, and recorded it. He then used that recording as blackmail to force the survivors to keep quiet. But let's just keep in mind, all of this is alleged at this point. Diddy has already pleaded not guilty to his federal charges. But just last week, we actually got some new info about those charges in a superseding indictment. To start with the very basics, the feds now say Diddy's alleged sex trafficking scheme dates back to 2004, whereas in the original indictment, it listed 2008. Here's what it says, quote, "From at least in or about 2004 through in or about 2024, Sean Combs, aka Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, Diddy, PD, Love, the defendant, and others, known and unknown, were members and associates of a criminal organization, the Combs Enterprise, or the Enterprise. Members and associates of the Combs Enterprise engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other activities, sex trafficking, forced labor, interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, coercion and enticement to engage in prostitution, narcotics offenses, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice." This new indictment also ups the number of victims. At first, only one victim was listed in the indictment, which some believe is Diddy's ex-girlfriend and the first person to file civil suit against him, Cassandra Ventura. An updated portion of the superseding indictment reads, quote, "Combs and other members and associates of the Combs Enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs's role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs's orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims, including but not limited to 3 female victims, victim 1, victim 2, and victim 3, to engage in commercial sex acts." The new indictment got a bit more specific in all of this too, doubling down on the allegations that Diddy took victims across state lines and sometimes even internationally to sexually assault and record them. The feds explained all of this too, writing, quote, "Combs subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse to cause the victims to engage in freak-offs and other commercial sex acts. Combs maintained control over his victims through, among other things, physical violence, promises of career and financial opportunities, granting and threatening to withhold financial support, and by other coercive means, including tracking their whereabouts, dictating the victim's appearance, monitoring their medical records, controlling their housing, and supplying them with controlled substances. During and separate from freak-offs and other commercial sex acts, Combs, among other things, hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair. These assaults often resulted in injuries that took days or weeks to heal. Following the assaults, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the enterprise, frequently worked to conceal his misconduct by offering to provide medical assistance or other financial benefits to the victims." A different part of the indictment reads, quote, "When employees, witnesses to his abuse, or others threatened Combs's authority or reputation, Combs and members and associates of the enterprise engaged in acts of violence, threats of violence, threats of financial and reputational harm, and verbal abuse. These acts of violence included arson and multiple acts of kidnapping, including one instance of kidnapping during which Combs carried and displayed a firearm. In addition, on multiple occasions, Combs threw both objects and people, as well as hit, dragged, choked, and shoved others. On one occasion, Combs dangled a victim over an apartment balcony. Here's where we've got to insert a statement from Diddy's team, specifically his attorney Mark Agnifilo. He told the Associated Press, quote, "The government has added the ridiculous theory that two of Mr. Combs' former girlfriends were not girlfriends at all, but were prostitutes." The indictment was filed on January 30th. Coincidentally, according to the New York Post, that's the same day P. Diddy was taken to a Brooklyn hospital from MDC. MDC is the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. It's where Diddy's been held since his arrest back in September. His team has tried multiple times for bail, but it's always been denied. So that's where Diddy has been for months now, but last week he was taken to the hospital. According to reports from the New York Post, Diddy was transported from MDC in the cover of darkness at about 10 p.m. on January 30th. He was taken to a Brooklyn hospital for an MRI after reporting issues with his knee. This actually isn't the first time we've heard about Diddy's knee either. He's apparently had problems with it since 2003 when he ran the New York Marathon. He even had multiple knee surgeries back in 2017. In a now deleted Instagram post, Diddy shared this photo and wrote, quote, "Just had my final knee surgery. They said I'd never run again. I said the devil is a liar, 2 exclamation points. 3 surgeries in 1 year. Third time's a charm, 3 exclamation points. Hashtag rebirth. Don't take the simple things in life for granted. Thank you to all the surgeons and docs and PTs. I thank God for y'all. And hashtag team love, hashtag thank you, hashtag God is the greatest." He also wrote, quote, "God puts us all through things for a reason. It's up to us to learn through the things that he puts us through. Sometimes you have to go through the pain to get to the joy. This journey has brought me closer to God, closer to my family, and most importantly, closer to myself, as this has been God's will." So apparently Diddy's knee has been bothering him recently, so he reported it. At some point, it was decided that he needed medical care outside of the jail, so he was taken to a Brooklyn hospital. He was only gone for a couple of hours and came straight back to MDC after his MRI was finished. Diddy's attorney Mark Agnifilo told TMZ, quote, "I cannot comment on anything related to prisoner movements. Also, I'm not commenting on anything related to possible medical issues." A statement from the Federal Bureau of Prisons was released too. It says, quote, "For privacy, safety, and security reasons, we do not comment on the conditions of confinement for anyone in our custody, to include medical status or medical trips." Well, the Federal Bureau of Prisons may not be able to comment on all of this, but I do know someone who can. I'm going to bring in Dr. Dwayne Hendricks, a former corrections officer and deputy warden right there at MDC. Dwayne, thanks for coming on with us once again. You're a friend of the show and give us a great interview every time. And what I wanted to ask you about today is Diddy leaving MDC to go to the hospital. Is this a big undertaking?
Not necessarily. Only in the format that it happened with him leaving later in the evening. Typically, inmates are given a physical within the first 14 days of their arrival, and if there's anything that indicates that needs immediate follow up, the medical team there will follow up immediately. However, if there's some procedures or some sort of medical processes they need to go through that are not available at the institution, or they can't bring someone in like a specialist to come in to perform that medical process at the institution, they will schedule medical trips on a monthly basis, and there's a review team that goes over those trips every month. And but this particular process was a little bit different because, as you know, most doctors' offices and most folks that do MRIs and X-rays and things of that nature, they're on a normal work schedule, between, the normal business hours of maybe 10 o'clock and maybe 6 p.m. So in that case, this was a little bit different, getting him outside the facility in the late evening hours to do just, possibly a basic MRI.
Yeah, I was thinking about the timeline too, because I don't ever recall going to the doctor at 10 p.m. at night. As you said, it's usually 9 to 5, 10 to 6 kind of vibes. But for P. Diddy, I can kind of understand why it was at 10 p.m. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking they decided to do this because he's such a high profile name that they wouldn't want to draw attention to it. I mean, this is an unassuming Thursday night around 10 p.m. Could that be why they decided then to go to the hospital?
Yes, and also, I mean, for a couple of reasons, staff. I mean, many correctional agencies are short-staffed, so you're taking someone out with this high-profile person such as P. Diddy. I mean, just the nature of who he is going to cause a serious security concern because you're going to need to be able to stave off, onlookers, fans, media, and the like. And then you also got to think about the security of the hospital and their operations. I mean, people there to try to get better. You have families there to visit their loved ones. And the last thing you need is somewhat, a chaotic environment that's causing concern with security. Uh, and also, just, most people don't know this, but he's actually under the primary custody. He's a U.S., what we call a U.S. Marshals inmate because he's on pretrial status. So the bureau, the agency, the Bureau of Prisons oversees, the operations with seeing the inmates, overseeing the inmates on a day-to-day basis. However, when they're in the hospital for an extended period of time, if there's no deal worked out between the local institution and the local marshal's office, it would be the marshal's responsibility to take custody of that particular inmate. So, but back to your original question, yes, he is definitely taken out at that time, and I'm sure this arrangement was made weeks in advance to make sure that that technician or that clinician was going to be available to take a look at whatever issues that he may be experiencing right now. So that way, there's not a whole lot of onlookers, and then even with staff and other inmates, it gives them not an opportunity to make a call, to their family. Hey, I think Diddy's going out to the hospital right now. If anybody wants to take a look at him, head out there. And then I think the other thing, Sierra, is since there are no cameras in the courthouse throughout this process, we've only been getting the sketch artist views of their perspective of what he looks like. And I think people have been talking about him losing weight and different things of that nature. So I know folks will probably want to be able to get a photo of him to see what he actually looks like. And I mean, and if he does have issues with his legs, I mean, is he walking with a limp? Does he have a cat? Does he have a cane or anything like that? So yeah, I think that would be the reason why that they would make this take this measure, which I've never seen in my career. Someone taken out to the hospital at this time of night for something as basic as an MRI.
Oh, that's interesting that this is the first time you've ever seen anything like this because there have been high profile inmates at MDC in the past, maybe not to the level of P. Diddy. You had a lot of answers in that one answer, so many different roads I could go down. And I agree with you 100%. People would want that photo. We would be talking about that photo today if for some reason we got it. So that's a super valid point. I wanted to go back to the very beginning though, because how does all of this start? Does P. Diddy go to one of the corrections officers and say, hey, my knee's really bothering me. I'm not feeling well. Would he go to an infirmary on site? What would the early process look like?
So again, after that initial review of his current medical situation during his physical, and then there's follow up to that process if there's something found, immediately. But you have to understand, daily there are medical staff walking through the units, doing what we call sit call and asking inmates, are they okay? And then you have folks that are walking around passing out meds and different things of that nature. And then he can also reach out to the medical team by what we call an inmate to staff correspondence form, whether electronically or in writing. And he can say, hey, I'm having, I've had chronic issues with my knee for several years. And I'm seeing there's reports that after he ran the New York City Marathon in 2003, that he had some ongoing issues with one of his knees. So that's how that initial process would start. And then and if it's nothing like emergent, because again, if his knee was bothering him to the point where he fell out or something like that in the evening, then obviously they would take him to the hospital right away. It wouldn't be a thing where they would schedule that out. But in terms of something that basic, uh, that would have to be looked at well in advance, and then they would make that appointment, and then reach out to the hospital staff and say, "Hey, you know, can you get someone that can one keep their mouth shut, that's going to be on schedule to work overtime or switch their schedule to do this particular procedure? Can they keep their mouth shut and not expose that, hey, we're going to bring him out into the community for a couple of hours to do this process. So there had to be some high level planning, not just at the local institution and the local hospital, but obviously probably at the regional office level and maybe even at the DOJ level, saying that hey, this individual is going to be going out for a short period of time to make sure that they're taking care of these issues that he may or may not be having with his knee.
Yeah, the planning into all of this, based on what you're saying, does sound like it was pretty specific that they wanted to make sure everything went through smoothly. And I wanted to ask you about the logistics. I know we've talked about this before, transporting Diddy to court, which we've seen him there several times. I mean, at least the sketches. Our reporter there has seen him in real life, but we've seen the sketches. As far as this goes, though, with him going to the hospital, is it different? I mean, would he be in his jumpsuit? Would he have cuffs? Would there be somebody with him at all times, even when he's in the MRI? What would that look like?
What would happen? He would definitely go out in his institutional jumpsuit. He would be handcuffed, leg irons, and what we call a Martin chain, which is the waist, the chains around your waist, handcuffs, and then the what we call a black box. That would be a little mechanism that would go over the handcuffs to make sure that he is not moving around necessarily. And I'm almost certain that they probably had 3 or 4 staff with him and even possibly someone in a different vehicle, what we call a chase vehicle, just to make sure that everything is secure and everything is well in that regard. Now, in terms of the X-ray, I'm sure whatever cuffs that would need to be taken off for the X-ray to be done, accurately to do the process. I'm sure if they need to take off a little bit of the handcuffs or the chain or whatever, and depending on where they were going, I don't know if they would necessarily take off the leg irons, but they would make it to where he would be comfortable enough to make sure the medical procedure is done in the right way, and the staff would be right there with him at all time. No one would definitely not be leaving his side.
I'm glad that you brought up the handcuffs because that was my first thought. Metal MRI, we probably can't put those two together. But as you pointed out, there was probably several different corrections officers or staff with him at the time. So it sounds like that probably went through successfully and he was returned back to MDC. But let's say, for instance, P. Diddy needs another surgery. He's had, I think, 3 so far, and he's been suffering from this knee ailments for about 20 years at this point. You mentioned the New York City Marathon back in 2003. So, quite a while he's had this. Let's say that he does need another surgery. What would that look like? Because I know the recovery process for a knee replacement is extensive. When my mom had it, I had to move in with her and help her with day to day things, but that was much different at her house rather than at MDC. So let's just say, speculate, he's going through with this surgery and then he has to go through recovery at MDC. What would that look like?
Well, I mean, inmates have procedures all the time. I mean, you have folks there with cancer, you have folks there with serious other chronic diseases, and sometimes it does require individuals to have surgery even while they're on pretrial status. So, it he if he would have to have the surgery, he would have it. He would go through the regular process like any other inmate, and then if the procedure does occur, he would stay in a local hospital or in a treatment facility, obviously with security there with him around the clock. And then when it's deemed that he can come back to the institution, he'd come back. I mean, there are several inmates in these facilities that are on crutches, that are in wheelchairs, and folks that just can't walk. I mean, there are people that actually show up to jail in a wheelchair. And you'd have other inmates there to assist them to move around the institution or the compound, or in that regard, a jail. But that's how that situation would be if he did need another procedure.
It's interesting to think about recovery inside jail, but it sounds like it's pretty common because, as you said, people go on with their lives. They could have issues, and it sounds like that's pretty much covered. So, if that's what happens, he will go through recovery there at MDC. My next question about all of this, too, it gets me thinking to kind of like TV shows or movies. So, correct me, this is like a stereotype. But sometimes we see inmates would purposely get sick or they would conflate their injury or illness because it's fun to leave. They get to go in a vehicle, then they get to spend some time at the hospital. Is this something that ever happens? I mean, would they make sure 100%, okay, P. Diddy really does need his knee checked out, or would they just kind of take his word for it?
Well, what the first thing you described is a person that what we call malingers, people who feign injuries, who are always constantly complaining about something, when the senior staff will make rounds to the unit or to psychological staff or to health services personnel. Um, yeah, I mean, that does happen. However, you got to keep in mind, he has to have, all persons have to have a physical within those 14 days. And then, by him having chronic knee issues, I mean, obviously they can validate that per se. And then again, it will be a process for them to follow up to schedule those appointments. Because, like you said, some people do want to get a break and just get out of the institution for a little bit, and get away from the day to day noise and just being in a cell or being around other inmates for a while, maybe even eat a little bit different food. But because remember, there was a story about a month or so ago about him just wanting to go because he wasn't feeling well. And he had to do meditation to calm down, and they didn't take him out for that. So, and I'm not saying that because I can tell you, we've sent inmates out to the hospital for hangnails or, hurting their pinky playing flag football or basketball in the unit, that kind of thing. But when it comes to individuals with a high profile nature and the security concerns that this particular person would cause, I mean, there's so many different conversations that are happening before a decision is made to take him or someone else high profile in that building out before they did that. So it would be very difficult for him to malinger and create a situation where he'll just leave just because he wants to get out for a few minutes. So if they took him out, it was for a reason.
And we have seen in the past, he's posted photos of him on Instagram where he's in the hospital. This is an ongoing thing pre his arrest or any allegations. We did hear about this knee issue. So it does sound like it is a legitimate issue that he's been dealing with for some time. And if that's the case, let's say that he's in super amount of pain. A traditional doctor would probably prescribe some pain medicine like opioids or narcotics, which are pretty, I would say, coveted in jail. You don't want to get those in the wrong hands. So, would there be extra eyes on a prescription if he was given something like that to make sure he is the one taking them and no one else has access?
Well, I will tell you, each institution has their own pharmaceutical staff, and those meds are highly protected in that facility. So every shift, there are staff going out, or typically in the morning and the evenings, there are what we call pill line. And let me correct myself. Typically, it depends on what type of meds are on. If they have to take multiple supplements during the day, then they'll give them that. But typically, pill line is in the evening time and a medical technician is taking those, and everything is counted. So I mean, there's not a pill that's not accounted for on a day-to-day basis in those institutions. So, so even if he is given some high-powered or high, whatever narcotic, that staff member is going to administer that to him or to any other inmate to make sure that they're taking it and they're not selling it or using it at a different time or playing games or manipulating the system. So it's a very tight knit process as it relates to medication distribution at these institutions.
There really is so much to think about down to these inmates receiving their prescription or them going to the doctor for their visits. Really a lot going on. And it sounds like you know a lot about it. So I want to ask you one more question about all of this. P. Diddy being the high profile celeb that he is, we've talked about this throughout the entire interview. It's the basis for it. The fact that he left at 10 p.m. and there were these specific or special, rather, procedures to get him there. Let's say he does need a follow-up appointment of some sort. Would you think a similar situation would happen around 10 p.m. in the evening? Maybe keep the hospital open late, a special doctor or something there to see him and to ensure that these people wouldn't talk about him or violate any sort of HIPAA law? I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, what would the next appointment look like?
It probably would look similar and maybe at a different time. Could be early in the morning or even later in the evening or in the middle of the night, just to keep everybody off their toes. Because at the end of the day, it's about maintaining safety and security. One for the staff, and two for Mr. Combs, and then the general public at large. So, whatever measures that needs to be taken to keep things off balance, I think that will be something that will be important to everybody involved. And then with his trial coming up, if he does need that surgery, I mean, no, all those things will come into consideration because obviously you don't want to be in the hospital in the middle of your trial. So they would probably try to come up with some sort of treatment plan for him if it's that serious, to make sure if surgery is needed, they can maybe put it off, or maybe his trial is postponed or something like that. But all those things will be worked out over the next couple of months, depending on what his condition is right now.
Really a lot to think about. But Dr. Dwayne Hendricks, thanks for coming on with us today and explaining this entire process to us.
Thank you.
Clear what's ahead for Diddy's medical care or his treatment, but we do know when we'll see him again. That's back in federal court on February 17th for a motions hearing. Another reminder, though, that the charges against Diddy are currently only allegations. He's maintained his innocence and has pleaded not guilty in this case.